Hi everyone and welcome. We're down here in my wormery, and out here on the table I've got some of the things that I'm going to be using today to feed my worms. And the first thing that you'll see here, if you're a regular, you'll recognize the old half and half carton here. This thing's loaded with coffee grounds as well as the couple coffee filters. Usually I'll clean the coffee filters and put them aside and stack them up as potential bedding to use in the future. But these are still covered in coffee and they're wet even. So I'll just be tossing those into the bins as I feed today. Down here in this bag, there's a variety of different things. Not a big variety, but you can see some cucumber shavings, some chopped up cabbage leaves, and a couple old portobello mushroom caps that spoiled in the refrigerator. These went in the freezer just yesterday, but they're frozen at this point, and I'm looking forward to feeding these things because even now, as they're just beginning to thaw, I can already smell them. Because if you've ever smelled spoiled mushroom, then you'll know that it's not one of the more pleasant odors out there. And what you see here, I almost let it tip over. Luckily, it's got a top that's shut. It's just some old spoiled breakfast cereal. It's puffed rice as well as a couple other things in there. All perfectly edible by the worms. And what I've got on the hit list today is the last of my bins that require feedings before I go away for a couple days. So it's the two newest of my Red Wiggler bins. And I'm even thinking I've got a outdoor bin that I might want to put any leftovers into. So if I've got anything left here after feeding down in the wormery here, I'm going to go outside and make sure that the outdoor bin is fed as well. Even though the outdoor bin was fed only 4 days ago, and the bins that we're feeding now were fed only 5 days ago, since I will be away, I just figured I'd play it safe and make sure that all my bins have a generous amount of food in them. And these are the last ones that I've got on my list. Then I can start packing, and I'll be out of here in a couple hours. So let's get to work. We'll begin with the older of the two bins. This one's been around for about 5 weeks now, I believe. And I've talked about potentially removing this piece of plastic covered cardboard at some point if the moisture levels in the bin start to look like they don't really need to be kept in so much. But in the beginning, when a bin is still relatively young, I do prefer to keep plastic over the top, just because the materials that a bin is built with don't tend on their own to hold moisture very well. I was a little concerned about this worm here. It just doesn't seem very mobile. Oh, maybe he's just resting. Look kind of pale too, but it looks like he's kind of coming to life. It's weird because the surface that was facing up is very pale. The surface that was down is colorful and dark. Still doesn't look too good. I'm wondering if that's a somewhat sick worm that's maybe, I don't know, on its way out. So you can always see when I've got paper right beneath the plastic, it seems to be a good landing pad for the collecting moisture that attempts to evaporate out of the bin but gets caught by the plastic. And then it just ends up condensing and dripping back down and landing on the paper. And the paper always ends up being a really favorable spot for the worms to hang out on, since they do like the moisture that collects there. So I'm just going to set this aside because we'll continue using it as an indicator to show where we last fed, which is where it was, right down here in the middle. So in the beginning, I'll always build a bin by dampening all the contents. You know, if I'm putting in dry leaves, dry cardboard, I'll make sure that I've dampened it so that it doesn't all go in there dry. And then over time, the main source of moisture in my bins is just the food that I add. But even though that's kind of a limited source of moisture, since the plastic is there, it doesn't vaporize, it doesn't evaporate out of the bin and stays there. So luckily it doesn't get depleted too quickly. We had placed this in here at the last feeding, which was, like I said, just a few days ago. And I didn't really put food in there. I just threw this cardboard piece right in there, as is. It's just funny to find how worms have sort of adopted it as a little kind of a cave to hang out in. I see a whole bunch of worms in there. I guess I could have stuffed it full of food, which would have definitely prompted the movement of worms into it, but I did not. I just placed it in there, and the worms really took a shine to going into there for some reason. This bin was populated not too long ago with what I estimated to be about 2,000 worms, and I guess there must have been a really delicious food item right here that they seem to be working on. And we're finding some of the other stuff that was placed in here. This is I'm guessing that this is just a piece of bedding that was placed in here during the last feeding. It seems like an old coffee filter. Here's some cardboard bits. And I could tell from the smell of this object that they're all surrounding. It's a chunk of apple. Apple has sort of a distinct smell as it starts to, it's not rot, it's not a rotting smell, it's more of like a fermentation smell. It smells like we're cooking booze down here. So maybe that's the part of the reason the worms are so jazzed about hanging out here, is because the because the apple is fermenting. Maybe it's becoming alcohol. So we're just going to set the worms aside a little bit, so we can make a little bit of room down here in the feeding area to drop in their food. Got worms all over my glove. That's all right. I'm going to begin with a little bit of cardboard at the bottom, just because bedding is a fairly important aspect to the worm feedings. And in the past, I've always just sort of dumped in their food and gone weeks and weeks without paying too much attention to making sure that they've got adequate amounts of bedding. But I've been trying to improve on that a little bit. So I'm going to take one of these old coffee filters that I bought down here, as well as this one that I found while I was digging through, and include that with the bedding underneath the food that we're adding. The cereal is going to be a part of the food they're getting today. And even one of the mushroom caps is covered in cardboard. Definitely has a little bit of a stinky odor to it. I've also got these shavings of cucumber and hacked up cabbage, which is what we're going to wrap up with here. And that's a pretty generous feeding. We've still got to put this piece of apple back in here. And hopefully we've left ourselves enough remaining material over here to cover up with. I'll try to put these worms aside and just use some of this material that was flanking the feeding area to try to cover up what's going on here. I don't think we put any worms on this side, so we should be in good shape just using this right from the edge. So even though right here on the outer further edges, there's just another sticker. Every now and then I'll run into one of these little stickers that's on the produce that I failed to remove before putting the food aside for the worms, but I pick it out when I find it. So the feeding area is pretty well covered. So I think that's just the way it's going to be left after we're finished here. So I'll indicate where the feeding occurred by placing this right back over where that was. As long as we're out here on the edge, let's see how things look. I'll tell you, for a fairly young bin, I'm seeing less and less bedding material and like leaves and cardboard and whatnot, the stuff that the bin was originally built with. So it does seem like a 2,000 population is a pretty good number to run a bin with. And if you don't start out too deep, you start out with a fairly shallow bed, then they should be able to, break that stuff down fairly quickly, and you'll be able to start seeing some pretty good results pretty fast. Let's see what else is over here. So yeah, this is just where all the worms were. So we can just try to get them out of our way so we can check out how the material on that side looks too. I'm sure it's going to be very similar. Nice and damp, but not muddy. No signs of standing water or anything, and there shouldn't be, just based on the way I apply moisture, which is pretty sparingly, if at all. If I can avoid it, I won't add moisture unless I see things starting to dry out. I'm usually coping with the other end of the spectrum. I'm usually dealing with bins that get a little bit overly damp because maybe I've left the plastic coverings on perhaps a little bit too long. And you know what? I'm just reminding myself now of something else that I had wanted to apply to this feeding, which I forgot to do. It just happens to be the thing that I always seem to forget. And those of you that are regulars here already know what it was. You don't have to be a regular either, because I showed you guys what I had planned to feed with today. So it's the coffee. So I'm just going to take this other filter out temporarily, and we'll save that one for the other bin. But I wanted to make sure that this bin gets some of this coffee here too. So that is definitely a nice, generous feeding for this worm bin. At this point, I'm just wondering if I've got enough material to cover up with here. Luckily, the plastic coated cardboard that I'm covering up with here does pretty much go out edge to edge, all the way to the very edge of the bin, providing any sort of intruding creatures, bugs or whatever might be interested in trying to get in here to grab a bite to eat, kind of limits their access. I guess here and there, if there's a little scrap of food on the surface, it's not the end of the world. Although just as a kind of a force of habit, I do want to always I tend to always want to try to make sure that the feedings I apply are sufficiently submerged below the surface. So, all right, I've got all this stuff here that we can continue on to the next bin with. So let's get this one covered up and proceed to the newest of my red wiggler bins, which at this point is only 10 days old. And being 10 days old, it's very light in weight. So it's always interesting to pick up a brand new bin and feel how light it is. The last time I came in here to give this bin, I believe it was its first feeding at that point, soon after being launched. I still didn't see any worms coming up to take advantage of this piece of damp paper, but as time progresses, they kind of catch on to where the ideal place to be is. And it's right there if what you're looking for is some freshly condensed dew that you want to come up and take a little sip of. And I usually want to get these little guys off the paper. Not so much because they're in danger by being on the paper, but it's more about them potentially deciding to go for a little walk while I'm not paying attention and making their way off the paper, and me not noticing, and then all of a sudden I've got dead worms on my table, which is something I don't want to have happen. In this bin, we're going to find a lot of uncomposted leaves and cardboard and all of those materials that the bin was originally built with. And since I count the food that I build the bin with as feeding number 1, when the bin was originally populated, it already, according to my counting method, already had its first feeding. So I believe what we're seeing in here are components of what would count as its second feeding, which was only 5 days ago at this point. So it wouldn't be surprising to end up with some food items in here that are still quite quite complete still, like that half apple we just saw. I'm not sure what it is that's drawing the worms so much to whatever is in my hand. But there's got to be some sort of a food item in here too that they're really going berserk over. Here too we could see a coffee filter, and I think I had talked about maybe trying to fish this coffee filter out at the end to use it as our feeding zone indicator. But it's already been chewed up so much that I think we're just going to use the one that's coming in with the coffee. Here's another tube, but this one doesn't seem like it was occupied the way the other one was. It's interesting. Yeah, there's lots and lots of bedding in this container. But I think just for good measure, we're going to go right to the bottom just to be able to know that we've submerged this newest feeding as low as we could. And even though this bin probably doesn't need more bedding, there is sort of an understanding in worm composting that you could pretty much never go wrong with what you might consider to be too much bedding. In other words, there's no such thing as too much bedding. So, I don't know if over here where all the worms were, if there's a piece of food I should be trying to return to the feeding area. I really didn't see anything. The only other things that I can see are this chunk of avocado and this piece of apple, which seemed to be a pretty popular spot. Got little tiny baby worms cruising around right there on the surface of it. Okay, so I'm going to give these guys a fairly similar feeding to what the other bin received. I'm really down to only a little bit left. Good. I wanted to try to get rid of that stuff pretty quickly, and I'm apparently succeeding at that. Here's the other mushroom head, which is still in pretty good shape. We'll give them a couple chunks of it, and we'll keep the rest of it for the outdoor bin. Some cucumber shavings and some cabbage leaves chopped up small. And we'll top off with the coffee, but like I said, we're going to preserve this coffee filter so we can mark where we last fed, the same way we did in the other bin. And that's quite a bit of coffee. So let's proceed with getting this thing covered up nicely. Might as well check the outer edges of the bin to see how things look. I always like to see worms at the far outer edges of my bins, because even though I've been using plastic more recently to keep moisture contained within my bin, and it does a great job keeping the moisture throughout the entire bin, in the past I had always covered up with things that allowed for the vaporization, the evaporation of the moisture in the bin. And I always found that the outskirts of the bin, furthest away from where I typically feed, which is down the center, had always been the areas that got rather dry and inhospitable for the worms. But with nice moisture levels everywhere in the bin, it seems like my worms are just as happy to be right out there on the outer edges as they are right where the most recent feeding was applied, as you could just see there from me stirring it all up. So that was pretty much unnecessary. There was really no need for things to get tilled up that way, but I did it strictly out of curiosity to see how this newest of my red wiggler bins is looking, and I think this bin's looking really nice. As you can see, as we stirred things up, it's not just the leaves and cardboard and all the bedding and the materials that the bin was built with, but scattered everywhere throughout. There's just castings all over the place. So they're doing their job, and after 10 days it looks like things are humming along quite nicely here in the newest of my bins. In the past I had always felt like I needed to apply water and make sure that the newest of my bins is just not, not running too dry. But ever since I've been using the plastic to cover up with, it's just become a non-issue. Just makes the upkeep of the bins just so much easier this way. So the two newest of my red wiggler bins are doing quite nicely down here. But before I can call it a day, I've left a little bit of material behind. I've pretty much depleted all the coffee grounds that I had set aside for this, but I still got a little bit of cabbage and cucumber and mushroom left that I saved for the outdoor worm bin. So why don't we just run out there really quick and give those guys this food, and then we'll be done. Alright, so this is going to go pretty quick because as you might be able to see, it's still raining out here. Everything's damp, so you could tell it has been raining, but it is still drizzling a little bit out here, so I don't want to prolong this activity. But if you were here when I last fed this bin, which was only a few days ago, I believe it was only 4 days ago, and that actually made me wonder if I even need to come in here and feed. But I figured just play it safe because the last feeding was a little bit sparse. I figured it wouldn't do any harm to give this bin a little bit more food. Since that last feeding, since there was rain expected, not just the rain we're seeing here now, but there was pretty heavy rain the other night, I left this bin uncovered. I left everything off of it just the way you see it here, and there was one night when it just rained and rained and rained. So this bin, when I just lifted it to put it up here to get in front of the camera, I mean, this bin it's got to be 2 or 3 times the weight that it was previously, so it is pretty much soaked at this point. So if it was too dry last time we checked in, then you might be able to guess that at this point it's probably maybe even too wet. But then again, I don't think the worms are going to object. Worms tend to really enjoy nice damp conditions. So just so we can get a sense of what it is that we're seeing here as we start to make our way down. On the very top are just some dry leaves that I covered with at the very end, but this stuff right here is some of the goop that came along with the worms when I had scooped them out of the outdoor compost bin, because besides feeding last time we checked in here, we were actually loading additional worms too. We always find this cork when we're rummaging around in here. And then a little bit lower down we could see some stuff that was placed in here. I was trimming my pepper plants. These are all leaves from the pepper plants. And then going back even further, we had used a whole bunch of grass, dry grass, to cover up with, because we always seem to use dry leaves to cover up with, but I figured a little change of pace, maybe we'll try covering up with dry grass instead, give them a little variety. So I think with all of this stuff that's in here, such as the leftovers from last time, which is all of this cabbage, as well as all the bedding material that was used to cover up with, I'm sure there would have been no danger of these worms in here growing hungry. But I just kind of felt like it might make good sense to kind of load up the food in this bin, and then I just don't have to worry about it. So let's just take what we bought from inside and drop it right in here on top of what's already visible in the middle. So it's a pretty generous feeding now if you think about it. Not only the stuff that we put in here now, but a lot of the leftovers that are still here from the previous feeding. And usually when I bring worms over, like I did just a few days ago, all of the stuff that comes with them out of the compost bin where I fetched the worms from, I treat that as part of the feeding too, because it is a lot of uneaten material scattered into this goop. It's not just compost, it's still a lot of uneaten goo. At this point it is pretty gooey stuff, but I'm sure a lot of it is just uneaten edible material. So this is really all I was looking to do out here. I don't want to prolong it because it is wet out here. Luckily it's not raining too hard, but I guess I could feel it consistently drizzling on my back. So I think we're going to proceed with getting this whole thing covered back up and put away. So let me at the same time here, amidst all the background noise, there's traffic and people working outside and all kinds of other stuff going on here. So really quick, as I'm putting things away here, let me just also say thank you. Thanks for keeping me company here. Like I said, I'm going to be away for a few days, and that's the reason I was just trying to get the last of my bins all fed. And and I think now we're in pretty good shape, so I can go away for a few days, a little vacation, a little getaway, and not worry too much about my worms. So we'll see how things look when I get back. So I'm going to save you the boring part of me just putting things away and getting cleaned up. But before I go, let me just really quickly say thank you. Thanks so much for watching. I really appreciate your company. Hopefully you enjoyed the video. If you did, please remember to give me a thumbs up. That's always really appreciated. And also consider subscribing to the channel too, if you haven't done so already. All right, everyone. Thanks so much for watching. Have a great day. Bye now.